Welcome to another broadcast of Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available as podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to the show. The plight of returning citizens, that is, formerly convicted or incarcerated persons in the U.S., has received more attention in recent years with the growing efforts in many states to restrict voting. To talk about the roadblocks and the discrimination that returning citizens face, we have with us Desmond Meade, who is a formerly homeless returning citizen and who overcame many obstacles to eventually become the executive director of the Florida Restoration Coalition, and he has led a successful campaign to re-enfranchise 1.4 million returning citizens in Florida. His efforts led to his being named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world and a McArthur Genius Fellow. Desmond Meade, congratulations on all your achievements and hard work, and thank you for making time for us this evening.
Well, thank you so much for having me, S.J. I don't know if I should say Reverend S.J.
No, you can just call me S.J. That's fine.
It's definitely a pleasure to be on your show today.
Well, I sort of wanted our listeners to get to know you a little better, so why don't we start with your personal journey. You have a really remarkable personal story of how you got involved in this work, and if you don't mind, we could start there so our audience could get to know you a little better.
I would love to. You know, typically when I tell my story, I tend to start in August of 2005. I was living in South Florida, in Dade County, to be exact. And on one particular day at the beginning of August, I found myself standing in front of railroad tracks, waiting on a train to come so I can jump in front of it. That day I stood there. I was a very broken man, and I was at the lowest point ever in my life. I was homeless. I was addicted to crack cocaine. I was unemployed. I was recently released from prison. And as I stood there, I didn't see any proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. I was void of hope and any self-esteem. And, you know, the main thing that was going through my mind was how much pain I was going to have to endure when the train ran over my body, whether I was going to have to, you know, suffer moments of agonizing pain or it was going to end quickly. And I didn't know, but I'm contemplating that. But even the thought of the pain that I may have had to endure was not enough to make me move, and I stood there and I waited for quite some time. But however, but by the grace of God, train did not come that day. And I end up crossing those tracks eventually. And about 2 blocks ahead was a place called Central Intake Facility that I went to, and they were able to actually place me in a drug treatment program. And I was in a drug treatment program for about 4 months. And after successfully graduating that program, I moved back into a homeless shelter. Now, notice I said I moved back into a homeless shelter, and because I lived in homeless shelters multiple times, and you know I've been homeless for multiple years. And you know, but this time when I moved back into that shelter, I made up my mind that I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do something that was going to prevent me from relapsing or using drugs again. You know, for any of your listeners or viewers that may have some type of experience with drug addiction knows about, you know, you would stop using drugs, your life would start to improve, and then something would happen to cause you to pick up a drink or a drug, and the next thing you know, you're back where you started from or even in a worse place. And I was tired of that. I relapsed many times. And so I decided, you know, let's do something different. And I ended up enrolling in a local college in Dade County, and I did extremely well. and was encouraged to continue my education. So after receiving an associate's in paralegal studies, I pursued a bachelor's degree in public safety management with a concentration in criminal justice. And, I was able to successfully complete that program. And eventually I was accepted into law school. And in May of 2014, I graduated with a law degree from Florida International University College of Law. And, I tell folks that, when I look back at, where I came from, and I understand that a lot of the things that I've gone through, the so-called negative things or the bad things in life that I've gone through have been a direct result of my addiction to drugs. But, what I've done since then have turned those negative things into something positive, and that have been very instrumental in getting me where I am today.
That's a wonderful, wonderful, moving story. What sort of roadblocks or discriminations did you find when you were trying to, as a returning citizen, when you were trying to integrate back into society?
That's a great question, S.J. There is a pastor in Ohio. I think his name was Father Boyle. And I never forget the statement that he made that, a person would commit a crime, they would get caught, they would get prosecuted, they would get convicted and sentenced to a certain amount of time, and they would be incarcerated in an institution and serve their time. And at the completion of their sentence, they walk out. And he said that the minute they walk out that door, those gates, that's when the real sentence begins. And so when you talk about the discrimination and the obstacles, there's, hundreds of collateral consequences that people with felony convictions or even an arrest record face, every day. And so even though here we are almost 20 years removed, actually over 20 years removed from when I committed my offense, and I still face roadblocks. I still, if I were to apply for a job in a lot of locations, a lot of businesses, I would still have to check the box, that, yes, I've been convicted of a felony offense. You have obstacles in housing. There are areas right now where I live in Florida that would not let me own or even rent a home in particular subdivisions unless my civil rights have been restored. And then there are apartment complexes that's not going to rent to you outright just for the mere fact that you've had a past felony conviction. And so even though, in my introduction, when you talk about that I was Time Magazine, one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and most recently been named as a McArthur Genius Fellow, even though I have all those accolades, guess what? There's some places that I can't live because I have a felony conviction on my record. And of course there's tons and tons of collateral consequences, but I think the biggest obstacle that we face is an obstacle that around narratives, that people who are arrested or people who have done time, been incarcerated, are somewhat less human than everyone else. And that's a big obstacle to overcome.
Right. Well, tell us about the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, the FRRC. How did it get started, and what is its work, and why do you feel it's important at this time?
Yes, so the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition is a grassroots organization in Florida that is comprised of people who had previous felony convictions, as well as family members who have loved ones that's been impacted by the criminal justice system. And, the organization as an organization was actually founded in 2011, but as a coalition, it existed prior to that. I believe the coalition started in 2003, as a response to address Florida felon disenfranchisement policies. And so at the time that the coalition was formed, it was comprised mainly of organizations like the ACLU, the Brennan Center for Justice, the NAACP, and many other organizations either based in the state of Florida or national. But eventually, we transformed that coalition into an actual organization in 2011 that was led by directly impacted people. It was very important for us to create this organization because we believe that people who are closest to the pain are often those that are closest to the solution. And so after forming the organization in 2011, I believe in 2012, we started some work towards creating a ballot initiative that would address felon disenfranchisement in Florida. Because at the time, Florida was one of 4 states in the country that permanently disenfranchised its own citizens. And so anyone convicted of a felony offense lost all of their civil rights for the rest of their life. And that included the right to vote, as well as the right to serve on a jury, the right to bear arms, and the right to run for office. And so as a response to that, we decided to launch a ballot initiative, and that's mainly what Florida Rights Restoration Coalition is known for, as the organization that spearheaded a constitutional amendment initiative in the state of Florida. That was successful, and in 2018, after passing what was then called Amendment 4, that amendment re-enfranchised over 1.4 million people in the state of Florida who had previous felony convictions. Today, as an organization, not only do we work on issues that allow people with a history to be able to vote, but we also address the barriers that prevent them from working, the barriers that prevent them from living in a home, the barriers that prevent them from getting an education. And so we're addressing as many barriers as possible to just make sure that when a person do their time and they're released, that they're given every opportunity to successfully reintegrate back into their community.
Now, certainly the disenfranchisement of people who have had convictions is by design. Some have called it part of the new Jim Crow system. How does those Florida laws compare to laws in other states? Is it similar, or is it just is Florida just a particularly bad state when it comes to that particular thing? How does it compare?
Florida is bad for a lot of things. I tell you, we're always on the list when it comes to something that's horrible. And this is definitely one of them, you know. And like I said previously, prior to the passing of Amendment 4, Florida was one of 4 states, to include Virginia, Kentucky, and Iowa, that permanently disenfranchised its own citizens. Florida by far was the worst, because when you looked at the numbers, at its height, you had 1.68 million people in Florida who could not vote because of a felony conviction. And, you know, that number represents the population, actually more people than the population of several states in this country and over, I believe, 50 countries in the world, when you look at just the sheer number of it. And so Florida accounted for, out of all the people in the country that could not vote because of a felony conviction, by itself, Florida accounted for about a quarter of those individuals.
Oh, goodness. Tell us about the campaign. You had said you led this successful campaign to re-enfranchise 1.4 million returning citizens in your state. Tell us how that came about and how did you do it? It's an incredible achievement.
Well, let me tell you, we had some years back, we had a governor, at the time his name was Charlie Crist, who instituted a policy that allowed for the restoration of civil rights for individuals who were convicted of less serious offenses. And that policy allowed over 155,000 people to have their civil rights, to include their voting rights, restored within a 4-year period. When the new administration came in 2011, the very first official act of that new administration was to roll back that policy and make it even more difficult for people to have their civil rights restored. In this particular instance, there was a requirement that people waited either 5 or 7 years after they have completed their sentence before being able to apply. And then after they applied, what we seen was that people were waiting 7 to 10 years just to see if they had a shot at getting a hearing, because it wasn't guaranteed that you would get a hearing when you apply. And so, what we've seen when you talk about just pure numbers, under Governor Chris, in 4 years, 155,000 people had their rights restored. And then the subsequent administration, the 8 years they were in office, less than 5,000 people got their rights restored. Right. And so one of the things that struck me was at the beginning when this new administration came in and revised the policies or rolled back the policies from the previous administration, it really struck me differently. And I was like really amazed just to think, because I believe that there is no greater indicator of citizenship than the right to vote. And being able to have a say in how this country is ran, whether on a national level or in your community. And with voting, with the right to vote being so valuable and so treasured, I found it scary that politicians, just 4 politicians, had the power to decide which American citizen get to vote and which American citizen don't get to vote, simply by the stroke of a pen. Right? And I just thought that was just too much power to put in the hands of any politician, whether they're Republican, whether they're Democrat or independent, that no politician should have that much authority over the greatest indicator of citizenship. And so that was like the motivation, because when you're talking about the right to vote, the right to have your voice heard, the right to feel as if you are a complete citizen of this country, then I felt that the best way to make that happen was to put it in the hands of the people. Take it out of the hands of the politicians. That way, you can minimize the impact that partisan politics would have on the decision to restore voting rights. Put it in the hands of the people. Let the people decide. And so we launched this ballot initiative to do exactly that. I think the biggest thing that I appreciated about the ballot initiative was how we went about the process, and the fact that, in November of 2018, on election night, we had, in Florida, the most difficult state to pass a constitutional amendment, because it requires 60% of the voters to vote yes, while most states require just a mere majority. Florida required a supermajority. And so it's very difficult. But on November of 2018, 65% of the voters voted yes on our amendment, and that represented over 5.1 million people. And what really gives my heart so much joy when I think of that is the fact that those 5.1 million votes that were in favor of Amendment 4 were not votes that was based on hatred or fear, but rather they were votes that was based on love, forgiveness, and redemption. And on that night, we showed our state, we showed this country, we showed the world that love can in fact win the day, that we can accomplish great things in this country, right, in a way that brings people together and is powered by love, as opposed to engaging in tactics that create or further divide in this nation. And so I was real proud of that, and we were able to create a grassroots campaign that encompassed or was composed of people from all walks of life and all political persuasions. We were able to continue to elevate our campaign above the partisan politics, and we were able to keep it elevated above even implicit racial bias. And we were in this space where we were able to connect with people along the lines of humanity. And so when you looked at those 5.1 million votes that said yes for Amendment 4, over 1 million of those voters were Republican, right? And so we showed that we created a broad cross-section of support. You know, we created a broad cross-section of advocates within the movement to help power Amendment 4 across the finish line.
It's an amazing story. So it sounds like you found that, politicians aside, the vast majority of Floridians, citizens, were sympathetic to this cause.
Yeah, you know, and I thought it would have been a little bit more too as well, because I mean, at the end of the day, you know, I've traveled this state many years, many miles. There were a period of a few years where I would drive over 50,000 miles a year on my car, just in the state of Florida. 50,000 miles a year, right? Mm-hmm. Talking to people from all parts of the state. And I rarely found anyone who, number one, did not have someone who they loved who'd ever made a mistake. I rarely did not find anyone who have never made a mistake in their life. And I found it hard to find anyone who, if they made the mistake, did not want to be forgiven. Mm. And our campaign was about saying yes to second chances. It was about forgiveness. It was about redemption. You know, as a person of faith, I'm pretty sure you would appreciate this. You know, one of the stories that I used to share with people as I traveled the state of Florida was the story of Christ, and when he was on the cross dying for our sins. And you had some returning citizens or people with some convictions that were hanging on crosses next to him. And one of them asked Christ to be saved, and Jesus didn't hesitate. His immediate response was, "This day you shall enter into paradise." You know, and that exchange between Jesus and those returning citizens, I think, really sits at the fabric, at the foundation of our faith. You know, and it really speaks to grace, of forgiveness, and redemption. And so mm-hmm. Jesus didn't ask him what he did. Jesus didn't ask him how long he's been clean or how long he's been out of trouble. You know, the response was immediate. You know, and I found that, you know, in sharing that story, there's so many people of faith that really understood what that meant.
Mm-hmm. Now, certainly the New Testament talks also about visiting those who are in prison and caring for them as though you were there with them in prison. But of course, as you've been talking about, their troubles don't end when they have completed their time, when they're released. What are some of the major roadblocks that the average person, returning citizen, experiences? Some of the aspects of discrimination, and I'm sure you know a lot of personal stories of the difficulties that they faced and overcome. Personal stories are great because they put a personal face, you know, human face on all of these important issues. Could you share some of those stories and with us?
Yeah, you know, there's a couple that stick out to me. I remember the young lady. She lives in Orlando, Florida, and you know, she was very excited. Over the years, she worked hard to change her life, and you know, was able to save up some money, and eventually she was able to buy a home. but she ran into a roadblock because the insurance company would not insure her home, solely for the fact that she had a felony conviction. And so when she told me that, I was like, okay, well, maybe her conviction was for arson, right? And the insurance company does not want to take a chance with someone who was convicted of arson or some type of fraud. And, I asked her, what was her charge, and it was a drug charge, a simple possession charge, so something minor. But to think that, 15 years after having that charge, right, to where, you're still faced with an insurance company that don't even want to insure your home, and because you can't get the home insured, you can't complete the purchase of the home because the mortgage company requires insurance. And so she had to walk away from that deal, of course, brokenhearted. And last I checked, she's still living in some apartment. I think about the daughter and the father, and not the daughter, but the father, who wanted to go on a school trip with his daughter. But because he had a felony conviction, he could not even go on a school trip with his daughter. He can't even, was shamed into not participating in the Parent-Teachers Association, not being a part of, his daughter's education outside of the home because of those type of restrictions. And I mention that because, when you talk about family and you talk about establishing a home, a foundation, a base of which to operate from, those things are extremely important to anyone, whether they're a returning citizen or not. But there are obstacles that we are facing on a daily basis, and I do believe that the main thing that drives that, right, the biggest obstacle we face is that narrative, right? And that's why one of the things that we've done in organizations throughout the country have been very intentional in doing was to just change how people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system are being referred to. That we're not a felon. We're wearing this scarlet letter of shame for the rest of our lives. You're a convict or an ex-con or ex-felon. And those were not terms that was conducive, number one, to our psyche, but it also was not conducive to our ability to successfully reintegrate. And it definitely was something that, or terms that painted a picture that created this illusion of us being less deserving. And so it's okay to deny employment to an ex-felon. It's okay to deny housing to criminals, and the rhetoric goes on and on and on and on and on. But the reality is that we're someone's son and daughter, mother, father, sister, brother. We're human beings, and we're just like anyone else. I think, I've heard people say before, the only difference between me and you is that I got caught and you didn't, right? But at the end of the day, we are human beings, and we should be treated with dignity. But that narrative is one that's most hurtful and hateful because it creates a second-class citizen tier. It creates this environment that allows for people like me to be treated different, looked upon differently. And those types of environments bleed into the ability to get jobs or housing or education or even to vote.
Mm-hmm. This may be sort of a touchy subject. I don't know how you feel about answering this question, but how does race play into this whole idea of disenfranchisement? Historically, certainly race has played a big role, I imagine. And the disproportionate amount of people of color who are convicted, incarcerated, particularly with drug charges. How does race play in this whole thing?
Well, I think there is a significant portion of this that's influenced by race, especially at its inception. And so when you look at the history of felon disenfranchisement, particularly in the United States, what you see is that particular policy really seen its resurgence during the era, during the Reconstruction era, or the time after the slaves were freed. And we've seen felon disenfranchisement be used as a mechanism to diminish the newly gained political capital of the freed slaves. And so, when after the Emancipation Proclamation, where slaves were freed and they had just as much right as everyone else, you've seen those former slaves actually exercising those rights, and you started seeing influx of elected officials that were African American, and that sight was not a pleasant sight for a lot of folks. And you see these laws, these Jim Crow laws that was created, whether it was felon disenfranchisement, whether it was something around poll taxes or literacy tests that people were given, and so it was specifically targeted for or towards African Americans. One of the examples that was given in previous court cases was in one state, what you seen was that people would lose the right to vote for hitting their wife, but not for killing their wife, right? And the reasoning was that the lawmakers were creating laws that would cause people to be disenfranchised, but those laws that caused that disenfranchisement were the laws that the politicians believed that the newly freed slaves were more likely to commit than anyone else. And so it was tailored towards trying to ensnare as many of the newly freed slaves. But what I tell people is this, is that there's no doubt as to the racist animus that was behind the felon disenfranchisement laws back then. But I look at felon disenfranchisement as a cancer or a tumor that is left unchecked. And so while it was originally designed specifically for African Americans, because this law has remained intact for so many years and decades, that what we see is that it impacts more than just African Americans. Yes, it does disproportionately impact African Americans, particularly here in Florida, where I think at its height, 1 in 4 black men couldn't vote because of a felony conviction. But when you looked at the numbers, man, African Americans only accounted for 1/3 of the total number of people in the state of Florida who could not vote because of a prior felony conviction. And so what we seen was it not only impacted African Americans, it impacted white Americans, Latino Americans as well. And there were significantly more white men in Florida and women in Florida who could not than there were black men and women in Florida. And so it was definitely, I think, a clear indication that when you leave a tumor unchecked, it would impact the rest of your body. And this particular, the tumor of felon disenfranchisement, attacked more than just African Americans. But if you dig just a little bit deeper, and understanding the racial motivation behind felon disenfranchisement, we also can see a much bigger problem. And the bigger problem is that since the inception of this country, there have always been a handful of politicians who wanted to pick and choose who got the votes for them. They wanted to pick and choose their own voters rather than having the voters pick and choose who should represent them. And, you got to talk about from the beginning, you had to be a white landowner to be able to vote. It's not too long ago that women won the right to vote. And when we look at even the history of that, we've seen how this country responded to women demanding the right to vote, that women were attacked, assaulted in the streets, and were thrown in prison, all because they stood up for themselves and they said that they should have a voice in how their country is being ran. And so we see it in many tactics. We see it in gerrymandering when they're drawing the congressional districts in these states. It all boils down to politicians wanting to pick and choose who votes for them, and that's a much deeper discussion to have. But if we're able to solve that issue, I think a lot of things will change as it relates to access to the ballot box.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that explanation. That's really, really good explanation. Now, you had mentioned in your personal story about the roadblocks to employment, for example, that you faced. What are some needs for reform in that area of employment, either laws or practices that cause roadblocks to returning citizens?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things, and we've seen significant movement in this, is around the band box. And basically, typically when someone goes to apply for a job, there's a question on the application that asks, have you ever been arrested or convicted, one or the other, sometimes both. And when a person checks that box, their chances of getting that job is drastically reduced. Most folks think that once they check that box, that application goes into the circular file, which is the trash. And they don't get an opportunity to really showcase the talents that they could bring to an organization. And so one of the major efforts that was developed by directly impacted people, and I believe in California, was the ban the box effort. And basically, it was to get employers to remove that question from applications, to allow a person to a fair shot at selling himself to whatever company he's applying. And once a person has demonstrated their value to a company or organization, and that organization decides that they want to move forward in the hiring process, then they can run their checks and the backgrounds to make sure whatever safeguards need to be in place are there. But the key is giving the person an opportunity to be able to sell themselves. And so one of the things, we're continuing to work on that issue because not all states, or not all municipalities, not all entities have gotten on board with this. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. But we know as it relates to employment, a change that would make a difference is by removing that question and giving the person a fair shot at getting employment. I think the other thing probably stems around liability, just like in housing. Employers have liability concerns because if they employ someone with a record and that person does something, maybe someone, a customer or another employee gets hurt by that individual, they could be liable for negligent hiring, right? And so to ease that concern, there are, opportunities to push policy that would minimize the liability that an employer would face if he were to hire someone with a history.
And how about housing? What sort of aspects of reform are necessary, you think, to overhaul that system?
Well, definitely, just like I just got through saying, something that we're working on now here in Florida is how do we create draft some legislation that would reduce the liability, the civil liability that a landlord would face. What we found in Florida was there are some landlords that would love or wouldn't mind renting to an individual because at the end of the day, their job is to increase occupancy levels in their establishments, in their apartment complexes. And if you have a returning citizen that's working and can afford to pay the rent, that's looking for a unit to rent, they would love to. However, they get a little skittish, a little nervous when they start thinking about liability issues. And so we were working on putting together some legislation that we were hoping to get introduced in our next legislative session to address that. So that's definitely one. There's also another program that's out there that's kind of detrimental, and it's a program that creates an agreement between landlords and local law enforcement. And so the landlord of an apartment complex would go into a relationship or a compact agreement with local law enforcement, and law enforcement would provide them information about people who are living in the complex or trying to rent units in the complex. And we've seen a case in Tampa, Florida, where a mother and her kids were evicted from their apartment because the son was arrested for shoplifting. You see, these agreements say that basically you're saying that if a person commits an offense while they are a resident or while they are a member of the household, that household can be evicted or that person can be evicted. And one of the things that just bothered us was it was just an arrest, right? The arrest does not automatically mean that the person is guilty. It doesn't automatically mean that that person is going to get convicted of whatever he was arrested for. And so to cause some type of adverse effect on the family by them being forced to be evicted just based off an arrest without a person having the opportunity to work through the entire legal system to have their day in court, we thought was very unfair. But a lot of apartment complexes are entering into these type of agreements under the guise of really trying to create safer communities. But what they're doing is actually the exact opposite, because when you're kicking people out of their homes, right, and they end up being homeless, you're actually increasing the likelihood of even more crime. And so we are pushing back against that and trying to get law enforcement agencies to not enter into these type of arrangements with landlords. And of course, on the other side, we're trying to get landlords to walk away from those type of arrangements.
What about the need for reform in the jail system itself and in sentencing? How do you see that, the need for reform there?
Yes,
Where do you start?
I go back, because at the end of the day, it's common knowledge now, United States as a country incarcerates more of its own people than any other country in the world. I mean, we're horrible with this. We have this insane infatuation with incarceration. A lot of that has come from the war on drugs. But the bigger driver have been this tough on crime stuff that has caused so many people to be locked up. And when you stop and think about it, it's not natural for a human being to be locked in a cage, right? It's not even natural for an animal to be locked up in a cage. And to think that we're taking human beings and we're putting them behind bars and in some cases we're throwing them in cells by themselves in solitary confinement, where there's limited interactions with other human beings, limited interaction with the sunlight, natural air, and really caging human beings like animals. There's just something that's inherently wrong with that. But we're able to have those type of systems when there's that narrative once again that says that a person that's convicted is a dangerous person and needs to be locked away and needs to be put in a cage, and it's okay that they're put in cages because they broke the law, right? You know, I have 4 sons, and you know, I can guarantee you that probably before the end of the week, 2 of them are going to do something that's going to piss me off. You know, but one thing I know is that no matter what they do, you know, they don't stop being my sons. And then the other thing is, in spite of what they do, you know, I would not lose sight of their humanity and the fact that they're my son. We have to, when you talk about changing the conditions of jails and prisons, we have to start from a position of that these people who are incarcerated are, number one, human beings, right? And when we really look at their humanity and not just their charge, right, I think we're able to approach, you know, terms of incarceration differently. When we're seeing that people may have been convicted, and quite a significant number of people have been convicted of what we call quality of life crimes, right? They've been convicted of doing things that putting them in a cage or putting them in a prison is not going to solve that issue. And it's not, you know, we don't have a rehabilitative system. It's more of a based on retribution than anything. And so understanding that, you know, when you're looking at a person as a human being and you know you're seeing what's going on with them, rather than locking them up, let's get them some drug treatment. Rather than locking them up, let's give them some mental health treatment. You know, over the past few decades, we have been replacing mental institutions with prisons, right? And not being willing to address the crisis that is happening right now in our communities, and rather turn a blind eye to it and rely on prisons or incarceration to deal with the problems at hand, does not deal with the problem. They just delay the problem. And so, you know, I think that, you know, when we're having discussions about, you know, jail conditions, I mean, I remember not too long ago we were fighting for women to be issued sanitary napkins. When you had women that were incarcerated, and by the way, they were the fastest growing demographics of people being incarcerated. And I think over the last 20 years, the rate that they have been incarcerated has been over 800%. You know, and to think that you had women that were not given sanitary napkins during the time of the administration cycles, women who may have been pregnant prior to going into jail or were raped while they were in jail and got pregnant and was forced to deliver their baby while shackled to a bed. You know, and those things are allowed when we have a negative view of people who have either made mistakes or been convicted of making mistakes. And so I think when we start changing the view of people, right, because it's very simple to me, you know, to ask anyone, you know, what if that was your mother? How would you want her to be treated? And if we would approach prisons and jails and incarceration and the criminal justice system from that lens, we would see a lot of changes.
We've been talking with Desmond Meade, who is the executive director of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, which is a grassroots membership organization run by returning citizens who are dedicated to ending disenfranchisement and discrimination against people with convictions. One last question. For those out there listening who may say, hey, I would like to get involved in some way, or I'd like to contribute in some way. What are some ways that people could get involved or contribute?
Yeah, you know, folks, I always love this question. You know, our website is www.floridarrc.com. It's floridarrc.com. And I encourage folks that there's so many ways when we passed Amendment 4 to restore voting rights to 1.4 million people with felony convictions, the Florida legislature enacted a law that required anyone who had any outstanding legal financial obligations to pay those LFOs prior to being able to register to vote. And what we saw was that there were a significant number of folks who were just too poor, and they were being forced to choose between putting food on their table or being able to vote. And you just thought that, man, there was just something inherently wrong with that. Access to the ballot box, being able to participate in democracy should not be a burdensome activity. That, access to the ballot box should be free and unencumbered, and what we did was we started the Fines and Fees Fund to help people who are too poor pay off their legal financial obligations. So if they wanted to, they'll be able to register to vote and participate in our democracy. And so we're constantly accepting donations to help people so they'll be able to vote. And we've also, launched a program that help people go to the courts or address the courts or petition the courts and to see about getting their fines and fees waived. And so people can donate, they can volunteer to help with the research process, because one of the challenges of Florida is that they tell you that you can't register to vote until you pay your legal financial obligation. And then when you go and ask them, okay, well, how much do I owe? State of Florida can't tell you that. And so we have to really do some painstaking research to really help people make a determination as to what their actual legal financial obligation is. And so just last week we did a research-a-thon where we had over 78 people on the call, and they were going through trainings and to help research cases, to help folks ascertain as to how much they owe, and then we can go from there and try to remove that final barrier to democracy.
Well, this is just a wonderful organization, and I want to thank you for just your outstanding work and your accomplishments. And God bless you in the future as you go forward. We wish you all the best and Godspeed as you tackle issues. Desmond Meade, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for talking about these issues, and we wish you all out there listening a pleasant evening, and thank you for tuning in. This is S.J. Munson signing out.